Hello, I'm Lugatorix and welcome to my Poland faction guide for Medieval 2 Total War. Today we're discussing the faction of Poland, its strengths, weaknesses, units, campaign strategy and all of that. Now Poland is, it starts off in the region which is marked in white on the map. There are two settlements, I believe it is Krakow and Halicz. They start off near to the Holy Roman Empire, Hungarians and Russians, but also surrounded by a lot of relatively easy to get rebel territory, so there's definitely a lot of potential to expand and have quite a big empire early on, which is, nice for Poland. They're in a pretty decent position in that regard. To complete the long campaign, you have to hold 45 regions, including the Jerusalem region. Their strengths are they make use of very strong cavalry, but their weaknesses is that they have somewhat mediocre infantry, which we'll have a look at in a minute. So I think first of all we should have a look at the units, and then we'll discuss some strategy on the campaign map. So these are the Polish units, and we're going to start off with peasants like we always do. I've talked many times about peasants and how that they are just not very good because of the poor morale and low in attack and defense. If you want to, hear me talk about peasants, look at all my other faction guides. Basically, I slate them in every single episode. We're going to go on to the town militia. First of all, these are commoners and peasants levied into local militias to defend settlements, and they're okay in a very, very early game. They'll do a solid job. I kind of just like to use them as garrison in cities because they're relatively cheap to maintain, and they'll do a decent job in the old defense. But 5 attack, 4 defense is nothing amazing at all, but at least they haven't got the poor morale like the peasants. Now we move on to woodsmen, hardy folk from the forests of northeastern Europe, armed with a large axe. I do quite like my axemen. The thing with axemen is very good on offense. 13 attack is pretty damn solid for an early game troop, but less so on the defense. They haven't got any armor or anything like that, and 1 defense. They're a little bit reckless in that regard. So I do quite like them in the sense they can be quite a good impact shock troop if you just get them to charge into a weak unit, and they'll cut the heads off like they cut the bark off trees or whatever. But really, if you're going to have them defending a settlement or trying to last a long time in a battle, then they're going to be less effective than spearmen or other troops. So we're going to move on to talk about spearmen, spear militia, which are basically a slightly better version of town militia, to be honest. They have, I believe, 1 better on the attack. No, sorry, the same on the attack, but 2 better on the or 3 better on the defense. So just a slightly better defensive version of the town militia. That's why they're better. They have a big shield. That's about it, really. Next, we'll move on to the dismounted Polish nobles. These are dismounted troops, and they have a 7 attack, which is pretty solid for the early game, and 14 defense, a lot higher than what we've seen in any unit so far. Coupled with good stamina, these guys are going to stand and fight for a pretty damn long time, and they can be pretty useful in that regard as well. So if you want a reliable troop to defend a settlement or defend a position on the battlefield, then dismounted Polish nobles will certainly do that job. They'll fight all day, basically. And then we go on to the halberd militia. Now, this is an interesting unit. Militia units armed with a halberd, which can fend off cavalry and pierce or crush armour. 5 attack, nothing special. 1 defense, certainly is nothing special. But they can form a spear wall. They are effective against armour, and they have very long spears. So an interesting unit. If you use them correctly, particularly against cavalry or armoured units, they can actually be relatively useful because these guys aren't as effective against armour despite having higher stats. So, personally, I don't see a huge amount of use for them, but if there is an armoured unit which you're struggling to take out, then this can certainly be a unit that can repel them, that's for sure. And that's pretty much all to say. The long spears I do quite like as well. That makes them more defensible. So that defense of 1 is a little bit illusory because actually, the units are going to be physically further away from their enemies, which is good to see. Now we're going to move on to the dismounted Polish knights. Now these guys are pretty strong indeed. They're well trained, they're elite like it says there. They're equipped with plate armour and a sword. Fighting on foot, these knights make capable heavy infantry. Well, very capable heavy infantry in fact. 13 attack, pretty solid indeed. 22 defense is very high, and you can see they've got that thick shield on, thick helmet on. They've got the big shield, they've got the proper plate armour. 22 defense means they're going to be tough to take down, with the charge bonus of 3 as well, which is pretty decent. But good morale means that they're just going to stand and fight all day. They're very unlikely to break. This is a very, very solid unit. Any dismounted knights are going to do a good job on the battlefield or defending cities or whatever. They're going to just fight all day, and they're not going to break. So dismounted Polish Knights, I'll rate them. And then we're going to go on to Spearmen. Not the most interesting name ever, it's just Spearmen. Regular troops comprised of freemen, equipped with some armour and a spear, able to form a defensive ring of spears. 7 attack, 13 defense, but these guys can form a Skiltrum, which is like a defensive formation. And yeah, I mean, pretty standard unit, but they will do a pretty standardly good job on the defense. A reliable unit, particularly in defending particular choke points in cities, or if you just want a sort of defensive line during a battle, these spearmen will do a good job. They'll hold the line for a little while, which is good to see. But that is all the Poles have in terms of infantry. Not a lot. If you compare them to my other faction guides, a little bit underwhelming. So that's what the game was kind of, sort of alluding to at the beginning, that they kind of lack that diverse infantry and the really, really strong units of infantry. So you're going to have to be carried a little bit by the cavalry, which is fine if that's how you like playing. We're going to move on to the missile troops though first. And peasant archers, again, I've talked about them quite a few times. They'll do a decent job in the early game, but obviously not to be relied on in the melee. 2 attack, 1 defense is nothing particularly amazing indeed. 5 missile attack is solid, but they're going to be, very quickly become redundant as soon as other factions get armoured troops or anything like that. But they can do a little bit of a good job in the early game, that is for sure. But there's no doubt about it that the crossbow militia are certainly a step up. These guys, 9 missile attack, so nearly double of the previous troop, but also a little bit competent in the melee as well. I mean, obviously, missile troops, they're not designed to fight in the melee, so that's not hugely important, but, it's nice to have that sort of extra layer of defense, that extra precaution, just in case the cavalry gets behind the line or something like that. And these guys can stand up and fight for a little bit as well. Or if they get put on walls and the enemies breach the walls, then they're at that last line of defense as well. So pretty solid job. Crossbow militia are definitely a step up from peasant archers. And then talking of archers, we have dismounted Lithuanian cavalry. I find it odd that they call them dismounted cavalry, just call them Lithuanian archers, but whatever. They're lightly armoured except for a large shield and are armed with a bow and sword. But now these guys, pretty solid indeed. Now 7 missile attack for archers is, pretty respectable, because obviously crossbowmen and, obviously better units like musketeers are going to have a higher missile attack. But for 7 attack for an archer, pretty solid indeed. But the good thing about these guys is, what I was sort of alluding to with the previous unit is even better melee attack and defense. 11 and 12 is very, very much comparable to a lot of the infantry you're going to have on the front line. So for these guys, actually can do a pretty solid job. They're a much more diverse unit of archers than you're going to be used to seeing. Dismounted Lithuanian cavalry, odd name, but a pretty decent unit indeed for the early game. And then we're going to move on to Lithuanian archers. I'm guessing that's why they didn't call these Lithuanian archers, because these are Lithuanian archers as well. It's a little bit odd. But anyway, skilled archery unit, lightly armoured but equipped with a large shield, able to lay stakes at the start of a battle. Well, that's quite cool. I do quite like the fact that they can lay stakes. That's pretty cool. But in terms of them as an actual individual unit, nothing particularly amazing. Their missile attack is exactly the same as the peasant archers, 5. But they are better than the peasant archers in the melee, 6 and 9 attack and defense respectively. So nothing particularly amazing, but if you want to use those sharpened stakes, that can be quite a fun thing to do at the beginning of a battle, that is for sure. But again, with the Poles, their crossbowmen and their archers aren't amazing, certainly compared to some other factions. So, that's a little bit disappointing in that respect, but they do indeed have the arquebusiers, which we talk about very often as well in these faction guides. A lot of the central and Western European factions have them. Missile attack of 14, attack and defense of 6 and 3 respectively. These guys can do a good amount of damage, but they're very, very close range troops. They're nothing, particularly amazing in terms of long range. So you're going to be wanting the archers and the crossbowmen if you're wanting to fight from longer range. But what these guys are good at is the morale debuff, which is very, very important in Total War, particularly Medieval 2 Total War anyway. And the noise and the smoke and the damage from close range will really cause a morale debuff to the enemy at certain points, and that can change turn the tide of a battle very much in your favour. So if you have troops, if you're fighting troops that are got some very good morale, hard to break down, and would usually cause a lot of damage before they finally broke, then these guys can speed up the process of them breaking, which is very nice indeed. And then we have handgunners. Now these guys are very, very close range troops. I mean, they cause more fear than actual damage, like I said. I mean, 13 missile attack is pretty solid, but they're not particularly diverse. But They do have an 11 attack and 13 defense, which they need because they're going to be fighting at such close range that they're almost in melee combat anyway. So it's an okay unit, but not one that I would personally use just because I prefer more ranged troops like crossbowmen personally. But again, if you need that morale debuff, if you need something that can get through armor maybe or something like that, then handgunners will do that job. But we're going to get on now to the strength of the Poles, which is their cavalry. We're going to start off with hussars. I think I'm saying that right. I hope I am anyway. Hussars. Renowned for their fast hit and run tactics, hussars are equipped with light mail, shield, lance and sword. Now I believe this is light cavalry, which is very, very solid for, you know, this kind of fast moving light cavalry. 13 attack, 15 defense and good morale. Pretty solid stats for this type of cavalry indeed. So I like these guys indeed, and the charge bonus of 6 makes them, you know, really quite powerful as well. They'll do a quick charge, they'll cause damage, and then they'll run. It's just like a hit and run, like it says. Pretty solid unit of cavalry to start off with. And then we're going to move on to the merchant cavalry militia. Poorly trained but well equipped cavalry who fight with a sword, which I think is rarer for medieval 2 Total War. Most of them fight with lances, but anyway, the attack isn't particularly amazing because the sword is going to do less damage than the lance. But 14 defense on cavalry, again, pretty decent, and the fact they're well armoured means that they're going to be, you know, less vulnerable to many kinds of missiles, particularly archer units, and they're just going to be hardier, do more damage in the battle, and that's good to see. But we're going to move on to the Polish retainers. Wearing brigandine armour and armed with a lance and sword, this unit is capable of devastating charges. 8 charge bonus. Very powerful charge indeed. Good morale, 10 attack, 14 defense. These guys are going to do a charge in the battle and cause a lot of damage. They're going to get units routing, and that's exactly what you want from your cavalry. And of course, they also have the General's Bodyguard. The General's Bodyguard is obviously protecting the General, the main man, the big cheese, and he's obviously going to need some very good cavalry to defend him. And 13 attack, 16 defense with a charge bonus of 8. Obviously, these guys are going to be good. And then we're going to move on to the Polish Knights. Well armoured and equipped and practised in heavy cavalry tactics, these knights make a fearsome addition to any Polish army. 13 attack, 17 defense. It's very, very high. Also with a very high charge bonus. May charge at orders. They're a little bit disorderly in that respect, but good morale, powerful charge, and well armoured. If they do charge out orders, they're likely to do a lot of damage anyway and survive. So it's not the end of the world. These guys are certainly fearsome indeed. And then the Polish Guard. These highly respected and feared troops wear plate armour and armed with a lance and sword. Lance and a sword, that's interesting. So 13 attack, 17 defense, 8. You can see all of this cavalry. Very, very high stats in everything, and a lot of them have got good morale. They're very well armoured. These are, you know, top cavalry units that can cause a lot of damage in battle. Infantry is going to fear your armies if you use these guys. You know, they are just about doing big powerful charges and getting units routing nice and quickly. And then for some reason we have the late General's Bodyguard, you know, a few later than the first one, but whatever. But just basically an upgraded, better armoured version of this geezer. Now, the Knights Templar. Again, very similar. I don't want to repeat myself too much, but elite and some say reckless knights formed to protect Christian pilgrims in the Holy Land. Yeah, and as I say in every faction guide, any unit that is fighting for their faith is likely to have good morale, is likely to fight that little bit harder for that little bit longer because they are fighting for a cause, damn it. And Knights Templar are certainly fighting for a cause, a very admirable cavalry unit indeed. And Knights Hospitalier, very, very similar. Well trained and disciplined, these knights are among the deadliest heavy cavalry in all of Christendom, and again, fighting for their Catholic faith, so pretty solid indeed. We're going to get onto the missile cavalry now, and we're going to start off with Lithuanian cavalry, the mounted version of these guys. Now they have a missile attack of 6 and a melee attack and defense of 9 and 11. Now obviously if you are missile cavalry, you know, your job is not to be in the melee, but it's nice to have that backup, to have relatively solid attack and defense. You know, if you compare them to the missile cavalry of Rome Total War, the basic missile cavalry anyway, I'm thinking like Scythian archers or something like that, they're completely incompetent in the melee. These guys are not completely incompetent in the melee. They can actually do a little bit of a solid job, but obviously they are more there to skirmish, fire around the edges of the fight and just get units tired and get hits on them, but they can't hit you back. So Lithuanian cavalry, very solid unit indeed. I do quite like them. And then we have the, oh my goodness, I mean, I'm not from Poland, I can't speak Polish, So if anyone is from Poland and watching this, please tell me how to say this. It is Strzelski. Strzelki. I'm sorry. I'm very, very sorry indeed. Anyway, it means shooter in Polish. You see, I actually do know a little bit of Polish. They are light horse troops protected by light armour using a small crossbow. Now, interestingly, a lower missile attack of the Lithuanian cavalry. They have one lower missile, but quite high defense for a a skirmisher missile cavalry troop. They are effective against armor. That's why they are in many respects better than the Lithuanian archers, because they can actually be more effective in the late game when troops are heavily armored with plate and chainmail and all that nonsense. So pretty solid unit. Do like them. I wish I could say that I could pronounce their name, but I can't. And we're finally going to move on to Polish nobles. Now, I think this is very, very quite rare for European faction to have javelinmen able to circle in front of their enemies and shoot. These excellent troops hurl their javelins before engaging in melee. And I have to admit, very, very impressed with these guys. Missile attack of 10. Now, it's rare for javelinmen to have a higher missile attack than archers and crossbowmen, but these javelinmen can do a good amount of damage. 10 is 4 higher than any other missile cavalry we've seen today, but also 17 defense, 11 attack. And now, I find with javelinmen, they do tend to run out of their ammo a lot quicker, and once they do, they usually become relatively useless. But these guys, 17 defense, they're still going to do a solid job and good morale. They're still going to be a solid unit on the battlefield, and they're going to be less of a liability than most javelin cavalry. Now we're going to get on to the ballistas and the siege equipment. Now, I talked about this in my England faction guide. They're pretty much very, very similar for all factions. So if you want to hear me talk about trebuchets and catapults and all that, go to the first faction guide I did, which was England, and I talk about them there, because there's just no point repeating myself. That's kind of pointless. But finally, we are actually going to look at the Slav mercenaries, poorly trained and equipped mercenaries from Eastern Europe, armed with spears. Yeah, these guys aren't amazing. They don't have poor morale, so that's a good thing, I suppose. But honestly, very, very similar to the sort of town spear militia kind of units that you're going to see in the early game. Useful to pick up in the early game if you just need 1 or 2 extra troops to bring along with you, but they're not going to be that amazing. They're a little bit disorderly. So, they are the units that we have seen for Poland. Let's have a look at some strategy. And here is the Polish starting position, which, well, what I'm going to do actually first of all is turn off the Fog of War. As I say in every episode, I do not ever play with the Fog of War off, but it's just so I can show you what's around, and it just makes it a lot easier to explain things. And as you can see, we do indeed start off with Krakow and Halich, and well, we can't even see the other factions. We are surrounded by rebel settlements: Prague, Breslau, Thorn, Vilnius, Stettin, Magdeburg. Probably wouldn't expand that far, but in the early game. But there we go. So where would I go? Now, you are a Catholic faction, so you do have to be a little bit careful, because if you just go straight away and attack Budapest, then you could face excommunication relatively early on. So you do need to be a little bit careful about that. If you're not bothered about excommunication, then go for it. But what would I do? Well, first of all, I would probably say the logical starting point is taking some of these rebel settlements. Make sure you get them before the Holy Roman Empire, Russians, Hungarians, or Danish get to them. That makes sense. They're free settlements for you to take and make a quite large empire, which is relatively profitable early on. So for me, I would be looking straight away at Breslau, which is very, very easy to take. Thorn, so you can get a nice castle early on. And Vilnius, I would probably go and take before the Russians could get there, because they're going to be focusing on Riga first. Vilnius would be quite nice to take. And, maybe if you're feeling brave, going for Prague as well, because it is a large town, so it's going to be giving you quite a bit of money. But once you've done that, by the time you've taken those 3 or 4 settlements, it is likely that probably the Holy Roman Empire more so is going to get excommunicated. If they do, you could go for the Holy Roman Empire. But me personally, I rather would go for the Hungarians. Now, the reason I would want to go for the Hungarians is because, well, there's 2 reasons. One, I want to expand south, and the reason I want to expand south is because the further south you get, the further near to the sea trade you get, the Mediterranean Sea. So if you're expanding in this kind of direction, yeah, you might reach the sea over here, but these seas, the Baltic Sea, is less profitable than the Mediterranean Sea. So it would make sense for me to move into a more profitable region. Also, Hungary only start off with 2 settlements. They have a weaker empire than the Holy Roman Empire, who start off with, what, like 4, 5, 6 settlements. So it's easy to take them out as well in the early game. But also, you want to be moving towards the Byzantines. The Byzantines are relatively weak in many respects because they are likely to be dogpiled from this side by the Venetians, this side by the Seljuks, and then possibly the Sicilians or the Hungarians are going to cause damage to them as well. So you can let them fight it out in the early game while you're just taking the easy settlements, and then just storm in with your cavalry, big load of Polish people, and just storm this area, take what is now modern day Greece of the Byzantines, and then you have a really profitable region and quite a big empire spanning from all the way over here all the way down there. So personally, yeah, you could go for Holy Roman Empire, particularly if they get excommunicated, but I prefer to go south. Now some people would argue, no, go in this direction. Take all the rebel settlements and then take out Russia, who only start off with 1 settlement. You can go for that. The reason I wouldn't is, 1, the region is less profitable because, well, there's no sea around here. 2, the settlements are they're much more sparse. They're much further apart. So, if you take Vilnius, well, Smolensk is quite far away. So if you have to get reinforcements to one of them, you're going to take a while to travel there. But also, it's going to take you longer to build this empire if you travel in this direction because it is less dense in this area. But also, I quite like it if the Russians get relatively big and expand in this direction. The reason is, if they go and take Moscow and Ryazan and all that, if the Mongols decide to come over, then they're going to be a great buffer against the Mongols. The Mongols are going to spend ages trying to destroy the big Russian Empire, which they've, formed over here. And by the time they get to you, well, there might be pretty much nothing left, which means that they will be pretty much a non-factor. So just let the Russians deal with the Mongols, and then you can just clean up after the absolute carnage that has occurred after then. The same goes for over here. Once you've taken Byzantium, the Byzantine area, expand in this direction, because let the Seljuks get destroyed by the Mongols, and then you can clean up afterwards. That's my idea anyway. My attitude is, if you can let someone else do your dirty work for you, let them do it, and then just clean up the mess nice and easily, and you've got a big empire in your hands. Why fight the Mongols if you don't need to? So that's my general advice. Take the rebel settlements, move south against the Hungarians, and then eventually you've got this very profitable region and relatively easy to take region off the Byzantines as well. That's my general advice, but hey, it's up to you. The good thing with Poland is you've got a lot of scope to do whatever you want, really. I mean, you can literally expand in all 4 directions, and there's no real rules. I mean, if you're, for example, Scotland, well, you can pretty much only expand south. Maybe you could expand this direction as well. If you're the Seljuks, you haven't got a huge amount of options, the Egyptians, but the Poles, they're right in the middle of it. You have a lot of freedom to go wherever you want, and that's quite nice. So, that's going to be the end of this episode. Thank you very much for watching. The next one will be the Scotland faction guide. Thank you very much, and I'll see you around.